Good morning. Today is Rosh Chodesh, September 1st. It is the 24th of Elul. It's actually, for those that know, it's Dr. Harosh, his father, David Harosh's shlosh. So that's today. And in addition, of course, we're dedicating our learning for refuah and wellness for all of Klal Yisrael, and mentioning a special mention for refuah shlemo kreva for Leah Bas Rita. As I mentioned off the recording, today with Hashem's help, we'll transition from Siddur the past, reviewing the malachot that are part of the bread baking process. Again, today you drive to the store, you buy a loaf of bread, you go to the bakery, or if you're really advanced, you go to the store and you buy some flour and make some bread. But once upon a time, not too long ago, there was a lot more involved in baking bread. And because that is the way it was in the time of the Mishkan, or something very similar, ultimately that's why we review or we provide the malachos from the vantage point of Siddur the past, organized along the bread baking process. And I just want to add before we start, yesterday we spent the rest of the day talking about boyer. We spoke, not boyer, grinding. Or applying flour to the mill. And we spoke about fine cutting. It's a big, broad subject. I think we did a good job touching on some of the basic points. As we're going to today move past Siddur the past, I do just want to mention that there are a few items that we will, Be'ezer Hashem, revisit. And one of the items that I hope to revisit sometime in the coming days is just a little discussion about mefarek. Mefarek, which we said was a offshoot of dash. Dash, we said, is crushing and thus extracting the kernel from the husk, and by extension, the mefarek, which is extracting perhaps liquid out of the item, and it's a little broader than that. I don't want to go into it now, but I just want to remind or put it out there that Be'ezer Hashem will review it, and that would help, or that would allow us to address a question I think our Kohen Gadol brought up, which was the question of squeezing juice. There's also a question of expressing milk or milking a cow. Is it acceptable? Could it be acceptable? So we haven't properly addressed it. I want you to know that we'll get to it, just not today. Today I want to go finish off Siddur the past, and then we're going to start the textile production process. I'm going to share the screen, and actually we're just a page off over here. Here we are, and we're gonna revisit the notion that we discussed a few days ago, which was not entirely but somewhat reminiscent of Dr. Hammer's, allow me to see if I can remember this, functional, was it functional fixedness? It's not exactly that. I'm sure there's another word, but I'm stuck with the vocabulary that were provided by our experts. But it's something akin to that, which is, again, how a single act could incorporate multiple perspectives. So in its proper application, functional fixedness was the ability to conceive that a thing can be used for more than one use, and which is a good thing to have that kind of creativity. Here we're talking about a single act or a single process that could be complex and incorporate multiple aspects of, or multiple malachos. So we're going to get there in short order in the course of today's study. I want to also thank everyone for being here, and as we approach the new year and we look out for zechuyos, for merits, certainly dear Jewish folks who have a lot going on, family responsibilities and life responsibilities, and take out significant amount of time every day to learn Gemara, that is certainly a merit that I think we can feel very comfortable and optimistic taking with us into Rosh Hashanah. And of course, I wish for all the dear members of this Chabura, they should be blessed with all aspects of the blessed year, in health and happiness and achas, gesund, koyach, and we'll add in arichas yamim, long life, to be able to be zoicha, to go at our medium pace all the way through Shas, more than once. So we have to add that now, more than once. So Be'ezer Hashem, a lot of gesund. All right. We finished Toichen, which was grinding, which the Gemara presents that it's possible, at least according to certain interpretations, which is primarily Rashi and Tosfos, and others' interpretation, which is the cutting finely. Although it's a different technique, you're not using a stone, you're not using weight, it's a knife or a sharp implement, but that could also be considered toichen. I just want to say there are Rishonim that say that the parameters of toichen should be much more limited, and just like toichen means grinding, pulverizing, well, toichen should only be the process of taking a solid and turning it into a dust like or a substance. And that would at least help us slightly understand. If you recall, we talked about solar silty, which we said was wood chips or wood. What was the other word we used? Sawdust. So we can imagine that if you say it's sawdust, it's a little closer to pulverized literally and absolutely, whereas if it's just a little wood chips, that's a little bit closer to fine chocolate. But that was yesterday's Gemara. We're going to move on from there. And we're now going to address the final steps of Siddur de Pas. So to this, we're going to graduate the bread baking process, at least for now, with the final two steps of halosh v'ha'oifa. So imagine for months, you've been working hard to plow your field and plant your seeds, and then to cut them and to bundle them and to thresh them and winnow them and sort them and sift them, or maybe crush, or maybe sift them and pulverize them, toichen, and now at long last you have flour, varying degrees of fineness, as you might recall. Not everybody processes the flour the same way. You have aniyim that can't afford an additional round of hand crushing or hand pulverizing the flour. It's a little more coarse. And you have a higher grade bread, which is going to be more fine. And then, of course, today we have bleached bread. But I don't think, I'm not sure from the time of the Mishnah, time of the Gemara, they were so, I think their bread was more wholesome. I may be wrong, but that's what I believe. And by the way, I think there are archaeologists who specialize in studying the exact nature of food in those times. And so there's a lot known about what food was like, but we'll leave it at that. Halosh v'ha'oifa. Now we're there. So there's kneading and there is baking. And now at long last, the Gemara is going to make an observation that we already know from the beginning of the Gemara. Amar Rav Papa comment. Shavak Tana Didan Bishul Samimonim. The author of our Mishnah rejected or left off Bishul Samimonim, the cooking of the spices, the pigments that are going to create dyes, the Haba Mishkan, which that is indeed what was part of the Mishkan construction process. And in exchange, our Mishnah chooses to use baking. Why don't we use cooking? All the other steps are very identical, or very similar, I should say. But baking and cooking are same in that we're talking about the application of heat. We're talking about the application. Excuse me just 1 second. I'm sorry. Doctor, pardon, I'm in the middle of a shir, but I want to say hello. So welcome, Doctor. All right, sorry about that. We have a new person in the community. Very excited. All right. So why did the Gemara, again, Rav Papa asks, why did we abandon baking, cooking and go to baking? What's similar is the application of heat to cause a food to be processed, but it's relatively distinct. So the Gemara answers our question that is now famous. Tana didan, situra de pas, nokat. The author of our Mishnah is choosing to organize the malachot, although in their source they were for processing samonim, according to sidura de pas, the bread baking process. Let's see how Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it. The sequence of preparing bread. Rashi, sidura de pas, shehis chobai, being that that's how we started the conversation. Nokat oife b'moken bishul samamonim. We chose to express it as baking as opposed to cooking. The haba bishul de pas, because baking is cooking bread. So although it's two words, but conceptually they are the same idea. And so we've been talking about this for a long time, but we only get this little gem in the Gemara at the end of our presentation of Siddur the Pas. You might recall Tosfos made a comment early on. But anyways, that is the initial comment here about Lashba. If any comments, questions, thoughts, particularly a comparison or contrasting between baking and cooking. Any thoughts, or should we take a peek into the next Gemara? All right, let's continue. The Gemara continues. This is where I told you about how, well, you see, Amar Rav Acha bar Avira. Rav Acha bar Avira taught a teaching about Melachos of Shabbos that might strike us as a little surprising. Hai man bishdos sichta le'atuna. A person who throws a beam, or Rabbi Steinsaltz says a peg, Rashi, shehishlich yosed lach letanor, a fresh or moist, what's the word? It's not dried out, it's fresh piece of wood into the oven, liyabshoy. Step one is that it's going to be dried out. Sheyis kasha, and dried out wood, in a sense, could be more hard, more solid than a soft, malleable, pliable piece of wood. So we're not saying that it should be permissible, but what would be the problem with it? Now, hold on, I see some quizzical expressions. So I'm not certain today if we would, if throwing wood into the oven is the ideal technique to harden a piece of wood, probably let it dry. But it seems like for certain implements, and again with limited insight over here, it seems like certain implements, certain wood materials, you might wish to expedite the heating process or even to cook it up, if you will, to a certain extent. And so the Gemara says, if you throw wood into an oven with the intention of it, well, Rashi says, with the intention of it being dried out and therefore harder, chayiv mishum mevashel. This would be considered mevashel. Mevashel. So there's two chidushim. One, which is al derech what Rabbi Menachem, I think, asked us in another context yesterday, which is mevashel exclusively food? We asked this toichen, or I think it was toichen, right? We asked, or no, it wasn't toichen, it was something else. It was the previous one. Anyways, we asked, are these concepts exclusive to food, or does it apply more broadly to other items as well? And so our Gemara here is answering that by saying, when you throw wood into a fire, it's considered mevashel. But there's a bigger chiddush than that chiddush of, is it only food? And that chiddush is, let's see, Shita, the Gemara says, isn't that obvious? Anytime you pop anything into the oven with the intention that the heat will cause the item to change its form, I believe we said previously about cooking, that one of the interesting things about cooking is certain foods become softer with the application of heat, and certain foods become harder with the application of heat. I think that's it's a vart that's said about the egg versus other foods, right? That certain fruits, like yesterday, our beets and our potatoes and our carrots, they get softer with heat, usually, especially if they're in water. Egg, for example, hardens in heat. So, but anyways, here, let's see. Isn't it obvious that when you throw something in the fire with the intention of it to change in its form based on the heat, isn't that cooking? More answers. There's a svara that we might not consider this cooking. Your intention is actually to harden, to strengthen what you've got. Rashi lechazik ve'ein kan bishul. I think what he's saying is that cooking usually softens something, and even the egg, which we said gets harder, it's relative. It doesn't become super hard. So maybe if your whole intention is to make, it's like, I'm not saying that you could do this, but if you're going to burn the chicken, if you burn it to a certain point, it's not cooked. It's waste. So if you're burning something to the point where it's going to be hard, maybe that's not mevashel. Kamash malon. Here's the chiddush. We learn that it is considered cooking. Dir mirfa rafi v'hader kamet. The nature of woods that become hardened in fire are, says the Gemara, that initially it softens. I guess the moisture becomes activated. Initially, it becomes softer. And then with time, when the moisture evaporates, then it becomes hard again. Let's see Rashi. The mirfi rafi. Rafi means, right, rifyon means to be, doctor, what's the English word? What's rifyon?
Weakness.
Weakness, softness. So, right, you could hold on to something, it could be loosely, softer. The mirfi rafi. It becomes softer al yedei choim ha'or. When the fire initially is applied to the wood, it becomes soft. Then the moisture is removed and it's extracted. And when the water is eliminated, kamit, miskasha, it becomes harder. So although the end product is a hard item, because part of the process is that it becomes softened, and that is a necessary part of the process to make it hard, therefore we view this as mivashel.
Rabbi,
yes.
we have no question about an oven, especially in those days, being able to dry the wood. What's going on?
I think they had very hot ovens. The shaila maybe is if it was obviously a science, which I'm not familiar with, to get something to harden without burning it. So I certainly cannot tell you, but I have a feeling there are craftsmen of different sorts that are very well trained and very well knowledge, very well versed in the exact science of applying heat to allow something to soften without burning it. But I obviously don't have more insight than that. So therefore, being that the end product is hardened, maybe it's not considered mevashel. More answers, yeah, but part of this process. Now, here's a question I bet you're thinking. Isn't kavana essential? And being that kavanah is essential and what you desire is the end product, and the end product is hard. So first of all, if you're asking that question, that is a good question. I have the same question. I imagine, at least according to Rashi, what we're going to have to answer is that you are mechaven for it to be soft because you want it to undergo the whole process. So being that you desire the entire process, and part of the process is that it comes to be soft, which would be a textbook bishul. Therefore, although your ultimate kavanah, the soif masa, is that it's hard, but you can't discount an intention, a desire, if you truly desire it. And being that you want this process to work, you need every step of the process. This is what I imagine would be the answer, but I would welcome further analysis or comments on this matter. So if anyone has anything to share, please help me out.
I think kavana is most important and influential when the cooking has to do with an accountant with his books.
Thank you, Val. We have any accountants on this chat? By the way, we have a fan of the shir, an accountant that listens occasionally.
Question is it harder or softer when you cook the books? It's harder to find the truth and whatever.
Doctor, I think it's a good muscle because Rahman al-Islam, a person who thinks they're going to cook the books, initially they think it's yummy, it's cooked, it's well good, but in the end, it doesn't pay. So I think it's a very good muscle.
Good.
We learn from this you can't cook the books on Shabbos.
Or ever.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Let's take a fast look at Tosfos. Hachi Pirushi, the ain by bishul klal. I would think it's not cooking period. Kamash melon the nihidi l'shuri monakam echaven. Although his ultimate end goal is that it should be hardened. Bishul miyayesh by. Ultimately, there is bishul. The mirpo rafi because it becomes softened. We're not going to. Tosfos is saying an important thing, and I think, Doctor, I think you'll appreciate this. Tosfos isn't saying to deny a person's kavanah, because kavanah is paramount. Kavanah is reality in Hilchos Shabbos, right? So to deny a person's kavanah is to deny reality. What we're saying simply is that the process is there's multiple steps in the process, and we can't look past the step in the process just because the end result is different. So I would like to say that Tosfos is somewhat agreeing with me. And indeed, the Perikim Amidin, Amrinan Gabi Hai Nachi, the Shada Sichta Latuna, he covered by Yisrael. We had a discussion earlier on in the Gemara about garments. Look up this Gemara. This is our Gemara. We learned it. Hold on. This is part of our portfolio. Hey, what's going on over here? Okay, bear with me moments. Lamed Ches, right? Bear with me a moment. Let's just look up this Gemara. If you recall, this is the Gemara that talks about bishul, about cooking. And then we talked about this is about Chame Teveri, I believe. Hold on, let's see. Uh-oh. I don't remember this Gemara. All right, we might have to skip it. I guess, okay, suffice it to say, ultimately the point is that if something becomes softened and improved, ultimately we're not going to deny that that is the case. I just would have liked to see the actual Gemara, but I'm not finding it at this moment, so leave it at that. Again, the point is, even if eventually it's going to become hardened, if you necessarily need the process, and part of the process is it becomes soft, we're going to consider that. That's about cooking wood. Amar Rabba bar Huna, another thought. Haiman, the artach kufra, a person who boils up tar, pitch. As we know, tar, let's see, chayiv mishum mevashal. This is considered cooking. So again, Rabbi Nachman, not only is cooking food, but cooking is also all different kinds of things that the application of heat softens it up, including pitch or tar. That when and we know this, you ever drive by and you see a truck and it smells terrible, they're doing the roof, and you see they have like a trailer, they're cooking up the tar. So it's considered cooking. The Gemara says, hold on. The previous Gemara was a chiddush. This is pshita. This is obvious, of course. It's cooking. It's textbook cooking. You're taking something that was hard and making it soft. Maybe you'll say ultimately tar, soifai is to revert to be hard. So maybe there, no. Therefore, the Gemara teaches us as a chiddush. So let's think. With the original case of the wood, it also becomes hard. The difference, I believe, is that if you take the wood out of the oven at the soft point, it remains soft. It stays in the oven, it becomes hard. Here, we're saying that tar is hot, but after applied, it ultimately softens. It ultimately is no longer hard. So it's not a permanent cooking. It's like a temporary cooking. So maybe it's not considered mevashel. Kamash malon, that is also considered cooking. So we have a new principle from the Gemara that cooking is even an item that when it rehardens, it's still considered cooking. Okay, that's a nice additional point. Let's do one more thing right now because I think we're done. No, not quite. Hold on. Let's peek at the Shulchan Aruch. Not yet. All right, let's continue the Gemara for now. Soon we'll see the Shulchan. Amar Rava. Rava for the talk. All right, doctor, here's where we're going to need your help. Hi, man, David Chavisa, a person who makes a barrel. Chayiv, Mishum, Sheva, Chatois. A single work product, a single item, 7 Chatoses. 7 sin offerings, 7 different sins. You got the guy's information? Took his number? What are they? So I'm going to let Rabbi Steinsaltz do the hard lifting. So you'll join me in the English. How could you be liable for 7 malachas if you make a single earthenware, a barrel made out of clay, out of earth? Here the Gemara goes. Because how do you make a earthenware vessel? He crumbles the lump of dirt. That's grinding. You need to make sure that it's a certain grade of fineness. You must remove, select the stone from the dirt. Rashi says this, but I think Rabbi Steinsaltz will make it easier for us. Number 3, you have to knead the mortar, this earthenware stuff that's eventually going to make the keli. You need to make sure it's well mixed with the moisture. You then cut the mortar into pieces for a suitable size. You have a big lump of clay, and you got to cut it up to make to specific dimensions to make a specific size keli. Then he builds the mold. That's boina, kindling the fire, because that's how you bake earthenware, and then baking mivashal. Let's read Rashi just to see the same thing. You must grind up and break down the earth into small, fine, grade, what do we call it? Particles. Have a toichin, that's grind. Then you must remove the pieces of large stone that will not allow the vessel to be made. Harish time. Then we sift it. No. I'm sorry, Umarkidon. We're then going to be mixing it, kneading it, mirakate. The Hainu Lush, which is a offshoot.
No, Markida Benafa, I think, should be sifting it.
I know, but for some reason,
It's not lush.
it's not lush. Umegabel is. So yeah, it's probably. Here's my question. I don't know if it's a separate malacha or if it's part of bar. Either way, you're sifting it out with a keli. You notice
So
you
it's
mentioned
probably
the keli.
Borer. No, actually, Borer was before.
So that's why I was trying to see if it's another malacha. So either we're breaking down boyer and mirakit, because in the Mishnah, boyer and mirakit are two separate things. You'll notice Rabbi Steinsaltz doesn't follow exactly this paradigm, which is why I was confused. So it looks like, according to Rashi, let's see, you have
Maybe the
grinding,
maybe the
sorting, sifting, kneading, mimareach hatit, you then smooth it. You need to make sure that it's smooth. Machik, that's smoothing. Umaver or you like the fire. Bekivshin with sarfoid b'soichai, hanim mivashel. Then he says, but one malacha that you should discount is digging. Because as you may recall, digging is not a problem if you don't need the hole.
Rabbi,
Yes.
would we presume from this, if it was half formed and he just finished it, he would have to bring 2 or 1 or whatever?
You're saying if he skipped all the steps and it was only makeh b'patish or something to that
No,
effect?
if he had the mold already there and the pile already there, and then he just did the last 2, could we
You're
then
saying
separate it? Say,
You're saying if the material was already prepared before Shabbos, so then all he's done is formed it and kindled it. I believe you're right. I believe you're correct. I believe there is
right.
It's plausible that one could avoid some of these steps. But assuming he's done all these steps, he would then be considered, he would then be liable.
The reason I asked the question,
Yeah.
the reason I asked the question is today, if you were dealing with a knife from IKEA and all you did was put it together, are you chayav for all the stuff to prepare the kit?
This is a good question. With Hashem's help, we'll have insight into this going forward. We actually discussed previously in the Gemara about putting together items too, if you recall. Remember that? I don't believe, if based on what we've learned in the Gemara, making something of parts that becomes permanent. Remember we talked about, was it the menorah shel chalakim? Something, it was a components. So I don't believe that a person that puts things together to become permanent is acceptable. It's not discussed in this very Gemara that we're reading, but it's a good thing for us to refresh our memory and recap the Ezer Hashem.
Can we go back to the Rashi for a second?
Here we go.
So I just want to maybe when you read Ubor Atzorot Agasot, Mituchan Haresh Time Umarkidan Benafa. The Markidan Benafa belongs to the borer. It's not a separate. The Rashi doesn't mean that that's part of the borer Atzorot Agasot. He takes the Tzorot Agasot, he puts them in a fine sifts it. So it's, I think that's one
I was
point.
inclined,
And then we go to. What?
I was inclined to read it that way too, but I'm now not certain. I think because we know that boyer and merakid are separate steps. And so it makes
That's
sense
correct.
that Rashi wants to expand our portfolio of malachot, right? So we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You have toichen, boirer, meraked, losh, memachek, mavir, and mivashel.
Okay.
So I think that's 7. But I that's why I too was confused.
No, I agree. Fine.
Go ahead. All right, so this is the 7 potential malachas. I don't think the Gemara is saying you would necessarily absolutely do all these steps. If you bought pre-prepared, if you brought a arts and crafts kit, and so the earth was already prepped, and maybe it was even in package in appropriate how do you call it? Divided per the size of a single keli, so then you might skip a number of the steps. And as you can tell just from us reading Rashi and Rabbi Steinsaltz, there are multiple shitot exactly how to break down this process of making this earthenware dish. Interesting Shiloh. It was my Shiloh. Why don't we list Makeh b'Patish? Why is Makeh b'Patish absent? Don't we say that the final making a vessel good, workable, isn't that considered Makeh b'Patish? So
Maybe at a certain point we have Rachmanis on the guy. How many carbonas can he bring?
yeah. By the way, the application now you know when you sign up for the application that we're making for all the malachis, you're gonna have to sign up. You want Shitas Hagoinim, you want Shitas Toisus, you want Shitas Rashi for the calculation of the malachis. You realize how complicated this project is going to be. If you recall, and I think it was one of the first days that our dear Rebbe, our Dr. Stamler was with us, so we reviewed Rashi and Makeh b'Patish, and we uncovered that there are different shitot in exactly the definition of Makeh b'Patish. Is there literally a hammer, or is it figuratively? Is it something that you need to do, or is it something that happens? So it looks like the conventional explanation that's given here is, based maybe on Rashi, is that usually if you're forming the kli, there is a final step that you must do. Here, when you place the keli in the oven, the final step is not man-made. The oven does the step. So you're in big trouble for firing up the oven. You're in big trouble for putting it in the oven. That's mevashel. Ultimately, the Makeh b'Patish is not man-made. And so that's at least one explanation of how we could avoid Makeh b'Patish. When you pop it in the oven, it's not ready. So that's not Makeh b'Patish. When you take it out of the oven, it's already ready. So,
Rabbi, not so fast.
I wouldn't expect to get off so easy. Go ahead.
Isn't it putting into the oven Makeh b'Patish?
So that's what I said. When you put it in the oven, it wasn't ready. Right? No, but I hear you. I hear you. It's a good question. I had the same question. I'm not saying that. I'm sure there are shito that would say that popping it in the oven ultimately is the Makeh b'Patish. But at least 8 teretz explain why Rashi doesn't enumerate Makeh b'Patish is because Makeh b'Patish is done automatically. If the Minchas Chinuch explains, like another sheet, maybe it was Tosis, that says ultimately there's no hammer. And so just like the hammer, the hitting is the final act. You have to be doing biyadayim, an act that makes it finally ready. So something that's prepped in a mold, let's say, sometimes things are made in a mold and you have to snip, they have like the attachments. So that might be considered Makeh b'Patish. You're making it market ready. However, at the very least, according to Rashi and the Goinim who Rabbi Steinsaltz is quoting, they don't believe that is considered Makeh b'Patish.
Maybe
However,
taking it out of the oven.
Just to complicate things, the Rabbeinu Hananel is not cited in this work, but the Rabbeinu Hananel, who is on almost every Gemara, the real Surah Sadaf, you have a Vilna Shas. you're likely going to have on it the Rabbeinu Hananel, who, by the way, was probably the earliest, most conventional commentary who comments on the Gemara, was printed on the Gemara. Rashi came after Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel, I believe, was from the end of the Gaonic period. Rabbeinu Hananel on this Gemara says, bear with me. Here he gives a different list. He says, you have the earth and you scoop it out. He says it's considered chayrish. So although we learned with Rashi that making a hole, you don't need the hole, it's not chayrish, he says that's chayrish. When you grind it up, that's toichen, that's two, according to Rabbeinu Hananel. When you sort out the stones, that's bayr, like Rashi. When you cut it, that might be mechatech. When you form it, that's binyan. And when you smooth it out, that would be makeh b'patish. So maybe Rabbeinu Hananel understands that earthenware, after you pop it out of the kiln, you have to sand it down maybe, or you have to smooth it out, or you have to break off some imperfections or whatever. So if you're doing that, that would indeed be makeh b'patish. So I guess what we can say with certainty is there are different shittot and how to understand this. All right, let's see the next item in the Gemara. Tanura, if you're constructing an oven, says Rava, chayiv mishum shmoina chatois. Now you could be on the hook, not for 7, or 8 melachas. What's the 8th melacha? Oh, just let me add. An oven is in many ways similar to a earthenware dish in that it's made out of the same earth in the time of in the context of the Gemara. But there's an additional malacha. So let's see Rashi first. Shlomberg, you want to close the door? The la'achar shetzarfa b'kivshan, utachal of tefillah she'yav v'omer miskayim. Apparently, in oven you also have to coat it with a special coating to make it more heat, not heat absorbent, but heat proof. Well, not heat proof, to insulate it more. And this is the final step of its malacha. You see, I skipped reading the Rashi inside, and I could have read it to you with Rashi instead of giving it to you outside. So basically, by the oven, when you coat it, that's the makeh b'patish. Abel gabi chavis leikush mishu makeh b'patish. When it comes to barrel making, it's not a makeh b'patish because the me'eleha nigmura malachte b'tanra. It happens by itself in the oven, and so therefore we're not going to blame the craftsman performing the barrel. By the way, I think there's certain kinds of vessels, pans. How do you call them? What are the pans that you have to put on a treatment? Like cast iron. I think cast iron pans or things of cast iron, you have to put a coating or a flavor or a prep. And I wonder if that might be considered makeh b'patish. It might not be considered makeh b'patish because I think you can retreat it, but just an interesting thing to consider. Suffice it to say, our oven that gets a coating, according to Rashi, that's considered makeh b'patish. Let's see what Rabbeinu Hananel would list as the 8th item. So Rabbeinu Hananel says that by earthenware, you don't need to do mamachik, you don't need to smooth it out, but by an oven you do. So anyways, there we have it. But we're not done yet. One more item. This is really gonna hurt. This is gonna make one hurt where it counts in the bank. Haiman da Avid Chalta, a person who is making a receptacle from reeds on Shabbos, says Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rashi Kaver Shulchan, yeah, a vessel out of reeds. Chayev achas esrei chatois. He could be liable for up to 11 different malachis, 11 different chatois. Let's see Rashi. Well, actually, the chayte lepume. If he finished, let's see how he does this. If he finishes the opening. It says it sews it, right? He sews the mouth of the keli. Rashi says, no. Lasas le'safa. He made it have a lip, an edge. Then you are tearing and tying. So we'll see that Rashi in a moment. So again, you make a vessel out of reeds. I'm imagining this is a woven kind of keli, some kind of basket. You can have up to 11. If you finish off the edge, you don't just leave it loose, but you sew it. One could find themselves doing up to 13 individual Shabbos melachas. Rashi Chayev Yud Aleph. Let's try this. Zoymer Hakanim. He's cutting down these reeds. That's considered Ketzira. That's a 1. Umishum Neiteya. And also potentially with reeds, they regrow. So you could also find yourself Chayev for Neiteya. Also Yachad, when he gathers them all together and he brings them into his work to bring them home, Hariza Ma'amer. This would be considered like the way you gather grain, Ma'amer, bundling the reeds. The reeds, they're much bigger than grain, but it has the same concept of how they're transported. Bira Yafais. Now, if we're not saying one necessarily does all these steps, but one may have done all these steps. If you selected out the good reeds and left the bad reeds, Hariza Boyer. Now you've also done Boyer. Hichlikan. Maybe you need to also process it to be smoother. So you smooth out the pieces. Memachak. This is memachik. Ason dakois. The achash taim ashalish. If you broke it down to be very small, this could be toichin.
Rabbi,
hold on, yeah.
This discussion reminds me the Haggadah, Kama Makos Kiblu.
Indeed. This is one of those. By the way, I'll just tell you as a side note, there is another place in Halacha where the Gemara talks about this. When the Gemara and when the Rambam organizes this as well, when it talks about prohibited relationships. So unfortunately, it's plausible sometimes that a certain person could be usher to be married or intimate with another person for multiple reasons. And so there too, the Gemara reviews how in a single relationship, it's plausible that there could be multiple different prohibitions that are chayiv misas bezdin, and therefore they would be warranting a chatas. But let's go back to Rashi. And yes, indeed, this is an interesting exercise. So you're making the reed, you cut the reeds, you are planting by cutting them a line to grow back, and you're selecting and you're bundling and you're smoothing it out and you're cutting it to precise dimensions and you're breaking some of it down into small pieces. I'm having trouble. I'll just tell you the truth. We're going to need to do some reading about this one. That I'm going to have to look into. If he sets it up so that he can start weaving it, now if you have two going across, now you have shtei batinir and you have two weaves. If you finished, you've done more extensive weaving, now you've actually woven. So 3 different malachas in this process of weaving. If he trims at the close of his weaving, so that the ends are all even, this could be considered makeh b'patish. As the Gemara says, we'll say later, if you cut off, if you smooth out the edges of a garment, that could be considered makeh b'patish. So suffice it to say, because he is weaving stuff, we've introduced the whole, harvesting and weaving introduce a compound malacha. I think that's the right word. Is it called a compound malacha? If he sews the lip, the ledge, lasais leisafa, hoisif kan toifer, they're stitching, they're sewing, v'koisher and tying, shetzarch likshar lachar tfir. If you stitch, you're going to inevitably have to tie. Here, this should not be considered boina, building. This is again another instance where Rashi is explicitly disagreeing with Rabbeinu Hanan and others. None of these 3 steps can be considered boina. Rashi is going to teach us an important principle according to Rashi. The ein binyan be-kelim. The issue of building, as big as it is, does not apply to the construction of kelim. Bipatish, lekol memar, bekonim. I'm sorry, that was bad. Mashit. Remember, bekonim they have shata l'ba'ar. Now maybe you're pulling off the outer layer, and that would look somewhat like skinning an animal. He says, no. Even though it might look kind of similar, maybe we're pulling off bark or whatever, that should not be considered hafshata, because the malacha of hafshata of skinning is exclusively with leather, with hide. Maybe some say that there's a necessity to put holes in the wood. By making little holes, maybe you're pushing it in, maybe that's considered teichin. Those tchinas, the fact you're making little pieces because you need the holes, that's not considered malacha shetzrich legufa, because you don't need the little particles, you need the holes that are made by removing the particles. But he says it is good, like we said earlier on, that you make them very fine, and that could be considered akin to toichin by making in very small parts. Again, my biggest issue here, the thing that I have the hardest time understanding, and admittedly we've gone through this fast, so no one's going to be tested on each of these steps, but the one that I'm still struggling is the toichin part. Even though Rashi clearly understands that it's a problem, he repeats it twice. He said, let me just tell you what Rashi said, if I understand correctly. Rashi says, listen, we said it's toichin because we've made very fine or thin pieces of the reeds. We'd have an easier way to say toichin, because sometimes you need holes to tie it or to insert the ends into. And when you make a hole, what comes out of the hole is little particles, which is kind of like toichin. So that would be easier to say, but it would be inaccurate according to the principles of the laws of Shabbos, because it would be malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. No one has interest in those little particles. They have interest in the hole that's made by removing the particles. So if you got it, good. If not, don't worry. It's
I'd put him in jail.
Taisvis. Let's just take a look at Taisvis to make things fun. Rashi told us emphatically, "Ein boina v'kelim." There's no such thing as boina when you're making a vessel. Taisvis says, "No way. That is absolutely not the case." Pirish Rashi demishum boina loy mechayiv. Rashi says both by the barrel and the oven and the reed thingy, it's not considered boina because ein binyan v'kelim. The ein nira strongly disagree. The dafka v'machzer mito menoyer shel chul yasamina. The ein binyan v'kelim. The only time that we said that by kelim it's not considered boina is when you assemble an IKEA bed. It's made of chulias, it's made of components. But if you're making it out of, I'm not going to say thin air, but if you're making it out of its most, what's the word? Basic compounds, ingredients, you're making it from scratch, certainly that would be considered boina. And we have the Amrina Bereisha Boina. There is a whole chapter on the subject. Haiman the Ayel, Shufsa Bekupina, Demora, Chai Mishum Boina. Suffice it to say, a later Gemara we're going to learn makes it clear that constructing something, making a keli can be considered boina. And Taisha says, by the way, when you learn later about glass making, we'll have another issue that we need to consider. But without going too far into it, suffice it to say, Rashi and Taisha have a vigorous and strong debate over here about if boina can apply to kelim.
Didn't we speak previously about the sofa beds and high risers and
yes,
right? Okay.
Yes. So that's I think what Taisvis was reminding us: the mita shel chulias, or the bed that's made out of parts exactly, and we also talked about a lamp. So that's what Taisvis is reminding us. So Taisvis says that's the waiver, the non-boina clause only applies if you're basically using pre-constructed components that just need to be locked in. Here, you're literally going to when you go to the earth and collect the dirt that's going to be mixed with water and applied to fire, that's considered building, says Taisvis. Or you go to the riverside and you harvest the reeds and you break them down and you make them. That's considered. Now, what I wanted to check now is let's now go back to Rabbi Steinsaltz. See, here he says builds the mold. So I'm not sure what he's saying over here. I'm not sure if he's saying that he built the thing that's going to go into the fire and he's taking Taisvis over Rashi, or if he's saying that there's another mold that the things are put into. But it looks like Rabbi Steinsaltz is rejecting Rashi and embracing Taisvis, at least in this context. That's what my sense is. And then we'll look in Rabbi Steinsaltz's enumeration of the 11 steps of making the reeds. He says the reaping, which means the cutting down, the planting. He stimulates growth. That Rashi agrees with. Gathering, selecting, smoothing. Cutting them into small pieces, which is grinding. How small do they have to be? Again, that's the one that I'm struggling with. Cuts them into particular measurements. He begins to weave. He stretches it. He gets the two things crisscrossed, and then he does the whole weaving. Crafting the object as a whole constitutes 11. So here he says boina. So again, Rabbi Steinsaltz, Tosfos, the Gaonim, they say that boina applies up here. Rashi says no. So there you have it. My dear friends, here's the good news. With this discussion, we formally step out of the conversation about Sidura de Pas. I know you're going to tell me this is also not part of Sidura de Pas, but it's connected because we had, by the first two instances where we're cooking it in the fire, it was considered mivasha. So that's how this extends to the conversation about the Sidura de Pas, the process of bread baking. In order to be honest and accurate with our announcement in the beginning that we'll move on to the textile process, let's begin. Although we're almost out of time, let's just begin the next Gemara so that we're now in the textile step. Hagoize is now going back to the Mishnah. We said that the first step of the next phase of Malachis, taking wool and turning it into material, into textiles, into garments. So Hagoize, again, in the Mishkan, there was no garments. Well, actually, there were the big Dekuna, but we're talking primarily about the materials that were incorporated into the Mishkan. So we have two malachis that we're going to quote together. Shearing the wool and then whitening the wool. If you recall, when we read it in the Mishnah, we talked about, I think Rashi, Steinsaltz talked about dumping the wool in the river to cleanse it of some of its imperfections. Now we're going to get a very interesting, obscure hypothetical that's not so obscure. Amar Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yechon. Bar Chana commented on this. Hatoivet semer shall gabe behema b'Shabbos. What happens if you want to skip the shearing part? So you take the wool on the animal. By the way, if you Google sheep that aren't shorn frequently can have really, really long wool on their person. So if you take the wool that's on the sheep and you weave it, and so you spin it while still on the animal, chayiv shalosh chatos. He could plausibly be chayiv for 3 different Shabbos prohibitions and thus have to bring 3 offerings. How? Achas mishum goizes, number 1, shearing. Achas mishum enapit, and 2 for combing. Achas mishum toiv, and 1 for spinning. Now, I guess what Rabba Bar Chana is saying is that if you spin it and then cut it, right? That's what the Gemara will be saying. So you've done shearing, you've done combing, and you've done spinning. Rashi? No, not yet. Rav Kana says, no way. This is not how shearing works. Well, let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz first. Since in the process, some of the wool is detached from the sheep. So Rabbi Steinsaltz is setting me straight. I got it wrong. What are the 3 malachis? You are spinning it. To have it spun, you need to comb it. And while spinning and combing, inevitably, you're going to be extracting the wool. Some wool is going to be pulled off of the back of the animal, and that would be considered goizes. That would be considered shearing. Rakana says no. You think a little bit of plucked wool off the animal, that's classic geziza? Is that classic shearing? And the fact that the wool gets combed while on the animal's back, that's not the malach of combing, because who in the right mind combs the wool while it's on the sheep? As a matter of fact, I think a little bit of the clumpiness of the wool makes it easier to keep together after it's shorn until you're ready to process it. And lastly, no one in their right mind spins the wool while it's still on the back of the animal. Probably it's shorter and a little harder to handle. What do you do if the sheep decides to roll over? Villa. The Gemara says, are you sure? Are you sure these aren't conventional methods of prepping wool on an animal? Now, you and I are probably saying, who would ever think that is normal? But let's see. There's a brisa. Mishmei de Rav Nechemia, citing Rav Nechemia. It says like this: Shotov be'izim, washing. I think that's what it is, right? Shotov. Let's see. Yeah. Shotov be'izim. They would, which actually brings me to another question. Why don't we list the lamed over here? That's what I thought. I would, if I was composing this, I would say take off geizes and put malabim, but that's not what happens. Anyways, Rav Nechemia says shotov be'izim. You washed the goat's wool, the tavo be'izim, and then they would spin the wool on the animal's back. Hang on. From here we can see that it is not unheard of to spin the wool on the animal's back. What are we talking about? Rashi. Kura kadarish. There is a pasuk that Rav Nechemia is analyzing. He's giving an interpretation. The pasuk describes in the construction of the malacha, the Mishkan, and it talks about how they presented wool. It says tavu es ha'izim. They spun, and it means to say the wool. Why does it say tavu es ha'izim? It should have said tavu es ha'tzemer. They spun the wool. Why does it say they spun the sheep? What is understood is that they actually would spin the wool while it was still on the animal's back. And here we're talking about goats, but the same idea. It's not unheard of to spin goats. I don't know if goats have the same degree of. I don't think they have the same degree of wool like sheep, but I guess there's something there. And so alma tavi al gabi behema shma tavi. You see here that it's not unheard of that a person could spin wool on an animal's back. The Gemara rejects this and says no. Just because a rare, unique talent, America's Got Talent, has a person that shows this rare ability to process wool while still on the animal's back, that's not considered the common method. We're talking about these women that had this really, really cool trick. What do we call it? A parlor trick? It's like the thing they show off. So they, in the pasuk says, these super clever, talented women were engaged in the process. But once upon a time, everybody did spinning, and not everyone could do that. The standard way of doing wool is you shear it, you clean it, you comb it, then you spin.
What did the
This is an unconventional manner. So let me just recap. I know there's a lot of words here. If you spin the wool on the animal's back, Rabbi Bar Chana says it's malacha. Rav Kana says no way, it is not. It's not typical. The Gemara pushes back, quoting a brisa, citing a pasuk that shows that women in the construction of the Mishkan spun certain wool on the animal's back, and the Gemara answers that is not a typical conventional way of doing so. And so Rav Kana's comment stands that that would not be considered classic malacha of spinning on Shabbos. This concludes, my dear friends, today's Gemara. Just to give a 30-second recap, because we need to let the Chumash class resume at the end of this link really fast. Today's Gemara, we basically closed out our discussion with mentioning of mivashel, of rather oife. We asked, why don't we use mivashel? And the Gemara said, because remember, we're using the formula, the format of bread baking. We then spoke of a few surprising scenarios. You can cook a piece of wood, and it's considered mivashel. Why? Because it softens before it comes hard. What about tar that always hardens afterwards? That also is considered mivashel. Then the Gemara went through a few items that you can have compound malachas. You make a barrel, you can have 7 malachas. We went through a little bit of the different ways of identifying those 7 malachas. Rashi, Tosfos, Rabbeinu Chananel. We then quoted 8 malachas if it's an oven, 11 malachas if you're weaving a basket. And then we introduced the textile process with shearing and cleaning. And the Gemara explained or brought to opinions, either that you could be chayiv if you did on the back of the animal, or what appears to be the more prevailing opinion, that it is not considered a malacha because it is not the conventional way. It would be kila achar yad, in an atypical manner. This concludes today's Gemara with one question that I want to figure out over here, which is what about why did we exclude malabin over here? And I also want to understand the teichen of the reeds, but Be'ez Hashem perhaps another time. Gentlemen, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Hashem bless everybody here with good health, prosperity, and all kinds of goodness, especially as we approach a new year. And a prayer for Shlema, for Leah Basrita, Yisrael. Thank you all for being on. Please rejoin this very link in just a moment to study Chumash. Final comments, and then we'll close out.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Thank you.
one thing that I think I would like to look into a little closer, we went over it quickly, that cooking starts from the fact that they had to prepare a dye that they used. So if we use that for every element in the Mishkan, we go back all the way. I mean, wood. Then we go back to the tree, to the cutting, to the planting.
Basically, we go back. The essence is the malachas of the Mishkan.
We don't have to do it now.
No, I'm just giving the 10-second answer. Every single of the malachas have to go back to the Mishkan. But we're fairly expansive and have a broad concept of how those steps might be applied in varying circumstances with slightly diverging technique, and it could yet apply. And so that's how we go from baking to cooking, from grinding herbs to grinding flour.
No, but if we have gold, it's metal. How far back are you going to go? Anyway.
All right, so we'll discuss more in the coming days. Yasha koyach, everyone. Thank you.
Shikoya. Have a great day.